Person Core? Excellent. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this first of the Critical Thinking series sponsored by the Critical Thinking Center and all the good people at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. I am Donna Warren. I am the head.
This is a reminder that face coverings are required in all UWSP campus buildings.
I live with this message in all the classes.
I am Donna Warren, and I am the head of the Critical Thinking Center here. I am also a professor of philosophy. And what's really exciting here at UWSP is this is the first semester that we are launching a brand new critical thinking category in the general education program. These courses are taught by faculty from across the campus, and they are embedded in the disciplines. So we'll be having like a forestry professor doing a regular forestry course, but it will center the critical thinking skills in that discipline. Or a theater professor doing a theater course, but it will center the critical thinking skills in the discipline. And it's an amazingly vibrant group of faculty, and it's an incredibly exciting project. And central to critical thinking, of course, and one of the explicit learning outcomes is information literacy. So I am thrilled to death to have two of our master librarians, Dave Detman and Troy Espy, here to talk about information literacy with you. I should note two things. This is listed as 2 hours. It's not going to be 2 hours. It's just when this was scheduled, I wasn't really sure exactly how this was going to shake out, so I thought I would rather schedule more than less time. Secondly, keep your eyes open for further such events, right? I think there will be some more. There will be 2 more this semester. Wonderful events. We'll have a professor of media studies talking about zombies, and we have a professor of music talking about Spotify and the ethics of different means of music consumption. And then there will be 3 more talks next spring too, in the next semester. So keep your eyes open for that. And for other events to celebrate UWSP's commitment to the development of critical thinking. So, yes.
I just wanted to say that if people...
This is Shawnee Luff, by the way. He's the Director of General Education.
Hi, everybody. If anyone is interested in some of these events that I was talking about, or future ones, the exact information, times, dates, places, are all available on the Critical Thinking Center website.
Yes.
So if you just search UWSP Critical Thinking Center,
yep,
you can find it.
Yep. And actually, they're not quite now, but they will be by noon tomorrow. so if any time after noon tomorrow you Google UWSP Critical Thinking Center, you will see it. Very good. Oh, and one other thing, we will be hosting a community read of Tanya Israel's book, Beyond Your Bubble. People will be having a free copy of the book if you want to register. And then meeting once for 90 minutes, either in person or on Zoom, depending upon your preference. And then in December 7th, Tanya Israel will actually be Zooming to talk with us about the book. So it's really exciting. You can also find information about that currently, right now, real time as I speak, on the Critical Thinking website. So if you're interested in that, please do feel free to join. So that's enough from me. Bring it on.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Warren.
As a librarian, I probably can get that book for you for free. Just ask the presentation. So my name is Troy Espy, and joining me is going to be Dave Detman. We are both librarians here at UW-Stevens Point, and really just honored to kind of be the opening act for this critical thinking series. I promise we will set the bar really, really low. Can only go up from here. So this is our presentation. When should you believe social media? So I'm going to give you a crash course for spotting fake news. I think you'll catch on pretty quickly. So now, if the news, if it supports your opinion, okay, if it supports your opinion, oh yeah, that's real, automatic, 100%, right? Don't question it. But if the news contradicts your opinion, oh, fake, that's fake, all the way, keep your zirconia, right? There you go. That is how you identify fake news. I told you it would be 2 hours. Okay, here we go. Well, even though I'm a librarian, I'm definitely guilty of this, judging news this way. And when we react to news this way, the fancy word is called confirmation bias, okay? So it's just where we readily accept information that reinforces our opinions, right? But then we quickly disregard any information that might contradict our beliefs. So in essence, Dr. Warren mentioned the bubble. We're placing ourselves in echo chambers, and we're hearing only what we want to hear. And I really believe, it's just a personal opinion of mine, that confirmation bias is why the nation is so polarized politically right now. And I really think that social media plays perfectly into confirmation bias. And I would even go so far as I think social media is probably the main driver of our polarization in this country. So how do we battle our personal biases while identifying fake news? How do we escape our echo chambers? Well, I'm going to share two strategies with you for battling bias and identifying fake news. And those strategies are transparency and corroboration. Now, they sound like fancy Ivy Tower words that only a professor would use, but the strategies are pretty simple, so try to hang in there. Let's start with transparency. So I want to give you an example here. So this is a graphic that came across my Facebook feed just a day or two ago. I'm old. Facebook's the only social media I use. So, and because of my political persuasion, my own political bias, I was tempted to believe it. Plus, I knew the person who shared it. I respect her highly. She actually has a PhD, right? But then I kind of paused and I started looking at these numbers, and I was wondering, well, where did these numbers come from, right? I didn't see a source. So then I screamed, but I didn't actually scream because I'm a librarian. I'm not much of a screamer. I'm more of a shusher than a screamer. But I find myself screaming internally anyway, often when I see memes on social media that don't have a source. So why is it important to know the source of information? Why? To know who created it. So information, whether it's a meme or whatnot, a graphic, especially on the internet and especially on social media, it seems just to appear by magic, right? But it doesn't. I mean, somebody put it there. Who? If you know the source, you can start to evaluate their qualifications. So is a person an expert? What is their level of education? What is their job? I don't necessarily want medical advice from a stockbroker, and I don't necessarily want financial advice from a medical doctor, okay? And then if you know who the author is of the information, who are they affiliated with? Are they affiliated with, say, a hospital or a university, or maybe white supremacists? And if there is no source, okay, if it's anonymous, I just treat it like idle gossip, and I just keep moving. Okay, I require transparency before I will believe anything on the internet. It's at least got to have the source. And this is going to make you students in the audience cringe, but that is why most professors won't accept Wikipedia as a source for college research assignments. So Wikipedia articles are anonymous. Anyone could write or edit a Wikipedia entry. So who's writing them? We don't really know. They could be experts, I'm sure some of them are, or they could be hackers. Are they biased? Are they unbiased? We really don't know because the articles are anonymous. Okay? You don't even have to create an account. You just to write or edit a Wikipedia article. And to test this, I went into an article recently, and I just started changing numbers at random. But then my Minnesota guilt got the better of me, and I went back and I changed them back because I didn't know. Again, I don't know if they were real. I don't know if they're accurate to begin with, but I didn't want to be the one leading, people astray. Now, the only qualification that you need to write or edit a Wikipedia article is an internet access. Okay, that's it. So that's not excluding many people. So that's really why it's hard to trust Wikipedia when you can't evaluate the author. Okay, so what? What's the big deal, right? So what if internet memes and Wikipedia are anonymous, right? They're not really hurting anybody, right? Well, probably not, but there are reasons you might want to know the source of information. And sometimes the source is hidden in plain sight, but we're just too lazy or too biased to look for it. So let me give you an example. So there was this website, and it was called martinlutherking.org, and it was about the slain civil rights leaders, you can see here. And the website looked somewhat educational here. You probably, I don't know if you can see it where you're sitting here, but it has some historical writings here. There's a civil rights library here. And then probably my favorite is down here. It says, download flyers to pass out at your school. Okay, so you can download flyers, give them out to all your friends, kind of like trading cards, right? Okay. So now this website, it's been taken down, and I think you'll understand why in just a minute. But if you Googled, really seriously, if you Googled Martin Luther King, this would be one of your top 3 results in Google. And then plus, it ends in .org, so it's got to be credible, right? Okay, I mean, all .orgs are credible, right? So what I would do is I would actually assign this website to my students, and I would ask them a simple question. I would say, who is responsible for the content on this website? And at the bottom of the home page, you do not have to dig, you just have to go to the very bottom of the home page. There was a link that said, hosted by Stormfront. I actually wasn't familiar with Stormfront, but if you click that link, and that link is still alive today, Stormfront is definitely alive and well, this is where you land. White Pride, worldwide. Every month is White History Month. This is a white supremacy group. Probably, I know the librarian, I'm a stickler on these things, but probably not the first place I would go to learn about a civil rights leader, right? If I wanted unbiased information. Not going to go to white supremacists, okay? And what really scared me, and I'm trying not to be too dramatic here, is that only about half of my students could identify that the author of that Martin Luther King website were white supremacists. Even though the link was plainly there on the bottom, only half of them either took the time or could find that link and went as far as to click on it to find out that obviously the website was hosted by white supremacists. And again, that kind of scared me because I'm thinking, if college students, you know, if they're having trouble identifying a source, and when you can find out the true authors in one click, I mean, what chance does a 3rd grader have who's just doing a school report and they Google Martin Luther King, right? So that is why I think it is really important to be transparent and to know who is responsible for the information that you are considering. Now, I kind of believe that there is actually even a loftier reason for being transparent about sources, okay? And that's whether it's social media or Wikipedia or white supremacy websites. When you're transparent about information, you empower the audience. You're letting them make up their own mind. And I'm going to give you an example. Fox News, yeah. Fox News. To some people, Fox News is nothing more than a mouthpiece for the Republican Party. And then to other people, Fox News is the only source that they trust, right? So if you're sharing information from Fox News, I really believe that your audience has the right to know where that information comes from, right? That way, they can make up their own mind if they want to believe it or not. So when you're transparent about information, you're really placing responsibility on your audience. You're empowering them to evaluate the information for themselves. And really, in this day and age of fake news, I think it's vital that we question and evaluate our information, okay? But when we don't know where that information is coming from, it's really hard to do that. Again, that is why transparency is important. Okay, so that was transparency. Let's move on to corroboration. Corroboration, it can be an effective strategy for identifying fake news and battling bias as well, but what exactly is it? So corroboration basically is ensuring that more than one source is reporting the same news, okay? So you want to make sure that other sources are independent of each other. So if your cousin Luke shares a meme and your Aunt Linda shares the same meme, yeah, that's probably not corroboration. I wouldn't count that as corroboration. It's probably more like duplication. But say CNN is reporting the news and Fox News is reporting the same news, to me that's corroboration, okay? Again, I have a pretty low bar there. So independent sources are verifying the facts, so it's kind of like strength in numbers. So if you suspect something might be fake news, check if anyone else is also reporting that same news, okay? And you can quickly do that. Dave's going to go into some other websites here in a little bit, but you can go to Google News. I like the Associated Press, or just go to a news source that you trust, okay? And see if they are reporting that same news. I once had a student who found a website saying that the U.S. Mint was getting rid of the penny, and that's been talked about for decades, right? And I'm just thinking, well, somebody else would report that. I mean, that's kind of big news, you know? So I went to Google News, I went to AP, I went to the U.S. Mint itself to see if they had any kind of press release or something. I could not find that anywhere else. I don't know where the student found that website, but it's obviously inaccurate, but that's how I verified it. Like, other people would be reporting that same thing. Okay. Hang on here, just a minute. So I want to give you a real-life example when corroboration actually changed history. So there was this conservative blog, it's just a blog, and it's called The Drudge Report. You might have heard of it. It's been around for decades. And I went on it just the other day, and nowadays it seems like it mostly just shares links to news stories from other media, okay? It doesn't do a lot of original reporting from what I can tell. But back in 1998, before you students were born, and what, Dave, you were 3 in 1998?
Oh, well, I go back a little further.
A little further, okay. So in 1998, the Drudge Report published an original story, and this is it. This is the actual story. And in the story, get ready for this, it alleged that the President of the United States was having an affair with an intern in the Oval Office, okay? Outlandish, right? Fake news all the way, okay? And a librarian could throw any kind of credibility test to this report and it would just fail with flying colors, okay? First of all, you're going to notice it's anonymous. Matt Drudge, he's the one who runs the Drudge Report. He didn't put his name on there. He's biased. He comes out and he says, yes, I am conservative. And then even within the article itself, there are unnamed sources, so not transparent at all, right? Plus, it's a blog. I mean, who's going to believe a blog? I mean, not me. And I definitely advise my students not to believe blogs for credible sources as well. Well, you probably know what happened. Well, other media started following up on the Drudge Report, and they started asking questions, and eventually, other news outlets were able to corroborate the story, and as crazy as it sounded, the story was true, and President Clinton was impeached. So, on its own, I don't think the Drudge Report would have gotten anybody fired, but it was because that other media corroborated the story, they independently verified the facts, that history was made, and that's corroboration. So, even if you don't use transparency and you don't use corroboration to evaluate social media, I at least hope you'll pause before automatically believing something on social media or automatically sharing something on social media. Because truthfully, there's only one sure way to guarantee that you are not sharing fake news on social media, and that is to post only cat memes, okay? So you stick to cat memes, you don't have to worry about fake news. Okay, I think I've done enough damage. I'm going to give it back over to you, Dave.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Troy. Good stuff. Some of what I have to share will echo what Troy had to say, but that's okay. I think we learn things by having them reiterated. I had a lot more detail than I plan on going into. That's kind of how I prepare. I just obsessively prepare for something and then really scale off, especially because my son called me right before I came up here and said that my Beer of the Month Club delivery that's been lost for 2 weeks in the mail has finally been delivered. And it's a perfect night to get out on the porch and have one, right? In fact, there was a social media post that came across my computer earlier today that said at this event there was going to be snacks and an open bar. I didn't go too deep into it because I had to be here anyways, but I hope you guys didn't get fooled. If you had just done a little research, you'd have realized, delighted to be here. Thank you. Okay, well, Troy talked about some strategies. I want to introduce you to sort of a formal approach that, that has been around for about 5 years or so. It's very simple. It's called SIFT. And it's essentially 4 moves that you can employ when you encounter something where the authority and the credibility is questionable. But before we dive into that, just sort of a look at the spectrum of the kinds of information that we are all battling with in terms of trying to determine what the agenda might be, what the bias might be. Troy talked about confirmation bias as being one of the strongest factors in believability, and that's absolutely true. But we have a lot of misinformation out there. And that's because it's a complicated world that we live in, right? Sometimes people post things unknowingly or without malice, just trying to share some information or a take or a perspective that they have on something. Disinformation, we're getting into fabricated content, deception to influence. That's, I think, the dark side of social media as a form of communication that's as pervasive and prolific as it is. In no time in history have we been exposed to so much information on a daily basis. And a new term that's entered in is malinformation. Private information being used for nefarious purposes, hate speech, and harassment. So kind of a nice Venn diagram of the different types of information that we're dealing with quite regularly. Now this is very different from the kind of world that we've lived in terms of information creation and dissemination previously. Journalists probably, I can't imagine that they sleep at night in this day and age as they go by the SPJ Code of Ethics. And that Code of Ethics sort of states doing things that are the antithesis of what social media tends to be for the most part. So the reason that I like to use this when I'm working with students or anybody who's interested in figuring out what to believe in terms of information that they encounter is that libraries have a built-in filter by virtue of the resources that we subscribe to. And that's incredibly important. If anybody is ever confused, not just students, but anybody, about the legitimacy of a source, there are not only library resources at your disposal, there are human resources at your disposal. Myself, Troy, faculty at universities. The Critical Thinking Initiative, I think, is an example of the commitment that we have to working together to unravel this very, very chaotic and sort of a labyrinth of information that we're encountering daily. Okay, well, just an example of the phases of information disorder. Most of you, or many of you, have probably seen this. It's become one of the most infamous, shall we say, examples of social media going absolutely viral in the history of social media. And it illustrates the process that a lot of this information goes through. So, an unidentified person, Troy talked about lack of authorship and that being a question right away. There are examples of entities that have existed, then don't exist, and then exist in another form, and then don't exist. And so this article was published on a site called WTOE5 News, which almost immediately went down after and then came up as something else, which they tend to do. But they were part of a network of 43 fabricated news sites which published over 750 different articles. I don't have the time span there, but that was over a 7-week period. So there's guys in basements, maybe drinking beer of the month, coming up with crazy stories to get clicks, right? And what sells? Politics sells, stars and celebrities sell, So they're doing this to generate revenue. Obviously, it's a big money business for clicks. But then it was shared on Facebook by someone working for the network of the fabricated sites. And then it was just amplified by people who picked it up and then shared it again. It's interesting how this eventually ends up playing out, because people who had an interest in Trump winning, you know, that they thought that this was good news, and people who wanted him to lose used it as evidence to show how the other side isn't following through in terms of critical thinking. So, just one real life example. Okay, but before SIFT, we had CRAP. Currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, purpose. I thought it might be useful just to sort of share the evolution in thinking in terms of critical thinking and information literacy in this particular area. This model is still widely used. I think Troy can attest to that. But SIFT is starting to overtake it for a couple reasons I'll mention in a moment. But one is that this has become kind of rigid in terms of its flexibility to meet the demands of evaluating information on the internet in this day and age. But there are still important things here to consider, and you'll see some of this resonating within the SIFT model in just a moment. So, in 2017, Mike Caulfield, he's an academic, but didn't become one until he was 50 years old. So it's ironic that cutting-edge technology for evaluating internet information would be somebody who wasn't of the internet age. It can happen. I still think I can be cool to my kids and my students. I'm 51. I still hold hope for that. But he said the CRAP test, and he's right, it actually comes out of old library collection development criteria. Not necessarily what students are willing to go through. A little bit more extensive in terms of the amount of effort that they have to put in. And I'm not saying that we live in a world where it's a path of least resistance, but I'm just saying we live in a world where it's the path of least resistance. I guess I just said the opposite thing of what I just said. People want things quick, right? Troy mentioned stopping, slowing down. We'll address that in just a moment. Questions you would ask as a librarian when deciding whether to purchase a book or journal for your library collection. So yes, it works well for people who kind of do this as they're living, but not so much for people who are just living daily, trying to figure out what's accurate, what's credible, what's authoritative. All right, well, the first move of these 4 moves of the SIFT process is stop. And that's hard to do in a world where everything is constantly moving. And clicking and getting information to another place is so easy to do. But there's a couple of quick questions you can ask. What is the website, the source of information, the reputation of the claim? It doesn't take long to do that, right? Very little time. And stop in the event that you go down a rabbit hole. And this is something I see my students doing on a regular basis. When it comes to doing any kind of information research, there's a question that they start out trying to answer, but as a result of the different directions that you can go, they end up somewhere else, very much different from where they had started. So, being able to remember what your purpose is when you're looking at that piece of information is definitely important. Okay, investigate the source. This kind of echoes some things Troy had said. And you don't have to do a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigation into a source before you engage with it. And I think this is important for a couple of reasons. One in particular, at least in my business, what I do as an information professional, is that students oftentimes, when they encounter something complex, whether it's through social media or by virtue of the research that they're doing for my course or another course, they don't feel like they're able or they've done enough in terms of life experience to engage with a source. But the opposite is true, right? I like to use the internet as the perfect example of scholarship as a conversation. You can have a social media post that begins as bogus, but then somebody clarifies it. And then somebody clarifies a point in the clarification. And pretty soon you synthesize all of that and you get to something that's as close to the truth as you can be at, using all kinds of sources and engaging in that conversation yourself. So giving them some empowerment from that perspective. The expertise and the agenda, obviously important. So investigating the source, very often not investigating the source, but the claim. Sometimes the source might not be a concern. Obviously, if it's a dairy organization saying milk is the best drink you could ever have, you don't really care about the source anymore because you know that there's bias there. But can you find that information in other places? And Troy alluded on that a little bit, if something's big, it's going to be not just isolated into one social media post. There's going to be other conversations going on about that. Trace claims, quotes, and media to the original context. I can't stress how important it is to do that little bit of work. Even if it's just a newspaper article. Very often my students will see a report that's mentioned and they'll be giving a sort of a very quick analysis of what the conclusion of the report was. And very often I've gone to the actual report and the conclusion that was given in the newspaper is radically out of context. So, newspapers are good sources of information, but if you want to get to the bottom of a claim, you need to go to the original source where that claim appeared. And images are incredibly devious in terms of being, we're such a visual culture. A picture says 1,000 words. So I've been more and more interested on visual culture. I think we think of social media as sort of posts, information in terms of words, but images taken out of context. I got a good example of one here. Mike Hetfield, of an astronaut, I'm not sure exactly what his name is, but this went viral because here he's saying, be quiet, he's going to smoke some weed up there. I don't know what that would do to you. But the actual picture was he was going to hide some Easter eggs for his other astronauts. So is he addicted? Does he like smoking dope, or is he really into Easter? Well, if you take this as the face value of the picture, then that's what he likes to do. So there are reverse image searches that you can do. Google has one where you can see all of the places where that image has showed up, and then all of the context, if there is any, in words that were attached to it. Very often people will be photographed doing something and then put in a different place in a whole different event. But it really sort of illustrates what the person that found the image wants to say in terms of that social media post. So investigate those as well. Very quickly, again, I like words. I have a master's degree in English too. I like to think of myself as loquacious, but my son calls me verbose, which has a more negative connotation to it, I think. It's all about context, right? When something's taken out of context, for a certain reason, it can be very compelling if it checks some of the boxes. But if you really care about acting on that information, it needs to check all the boxes. And Mike Caulfield has pointed out this does not take much time. Most of what we do is the really shallow kind of thing. On the surface, we just ask 2 or 3 questions, and we realize by virtue of those 2 or 3 questions that we're dealing with something that we might put into our pocket as a piece of information, but we're not going to share it with the world. Okay, here's an example of SIFT being put to work. Recently, actually I think in July, this summer, there was a tweet that came out that dealt with the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who came out and said that people who were not vaccinated should stay home because they were endangering people who were vaccinated and who needed to move around, including his adolescent daughters. So this was forwarded all over the place. Even the gentleman who was writing about this, who was vaccinated, felt at the moment when he read it that he wanted to share it because he was kind of angry that people were not getting vaccinated. And here's something that maybe Biden should do for our safety as a nation. Well, and that's, didn't need to go there, but that's okay. We can stay right here. I will just tell you that, long story short of that, the post was by a person who, at least on Twitter, turned out to have journalist credentials, but that doesn't really tell you a whole lot. Nobody really knows how you become a journalist on Twitter. It might be a box you fill in. I don't have a Twitter account, but and also the avatar for the site was President Trump behind bars with his hands on a couple of bars. Not something a journalist of reputation is going to use as an avatar. The gentleman who saw that went out and looked for other examples of that, could not find the quotation mark speech that was given in the social media post. That's big news. If a country is saying, you stay home, you're going to need to stay home if you're not vaccinated, that's going to be reported everywhere. It was not. And finally, somebody went out and looked at his family, and he has no children of his own. He has a 36-year-old stepdaughter, but no adolescent children. So all of that information, much of it, was fabricated by somebody who wanted to send a message that maybe we need to be progressive like France in terms of this particular topic. I share this because higher education is interested in this sort of thing. I think students are always surprised to see that people care about actual academic methodological studies that deal with things like social media. I think in some ways it legitimizes the importance of it. I think we talk trivially about it a lot. We laugh at some of the headlines that are out there. But academics are really digging into this to figure out what might be some solutions to what has become, as Troy mentioned, an extremely pervasive problem contributing greatly to the polarization of the conversations we're having as a nation. Okay. Growing opportunities in higher education. I am delighted to have an opportunity in the spring to teach a 3-credit course called Critical Approaches to Information Research, which will contain a lot of information and exercises for students to do regarding this. I think higher education is realizing the importance of information literacy as sort of one of those skills underneath the umbrella of critical thinking. So I'm delighted to have an opportunity to do that. Having a 3-credit course really puts us on the map as an information literacy program. It's not all that common, but it's becoming more common because of the information world that we live in. Just a couple of screenshots left, and then I want to turn it over to you guys to share some of your experiences regarding this topic. If you're interested, and these slides can probably go up at some point.
Yes, absolutely.
Mike Caulfield gives a great interview, about a 38-minute interview about SIFT and why he created it and why he created it the way that he did, talking about the information landscape in general that we all live in. Dr. Warren turned me on to this, called Truth Decay, put out by the RAND Corporation, an initial explanation of the diminishing role of facts and analysis in American public life. It's fascinating. There are some research questions which I'll redo in a moment on a final slide that you might react to in terms of a group conversation. It is 328 pages long, so it could become brain decay too. But it is really good. If you have some time to engage with it, I would certainly recommend it. And just to echo, in the echo chamber, to echo what Troy had mentioned, filter bubbles, they throw a wrench into a lot of this, again, because it feeds the confirmation bias. And I've noticed this more and more even with my own browsing habits. The sort of notifications that I get in terms of messaging are ones that I'm more likely to accept than not accept, to more likely to click than not click. Not because they're necessarily true or ironclad in terms of authority or credibility, but because they play on my perceptions of a particular topic. So I'm always recommending that students take a deep breath, stop, take the emotion out of it, and then proceed from that point. There are some places that you can go, some really good sites, and they're listed here, factcheck.org, PolitiFact, Snopes, places that are dedicated to helping people get to the bottom of posts that go viral and that maybe are going to influence them to act in one way or another based on that information. So a lot of good organizations out there right now that are working towards making this a less murky, foggy kind of information landscape. Just a few citations from some research that was included in here. And we don't need to, we're a small enough group that I think we can talk about this without pairing up, but here's some potential springboards to conversation, but I'm always interested to hear from my audience what we've said resonates with you, maybe aligns with your own experiences, or what your experiences have been with social media. Anything that you have to react to would be appreciated. So I'll turn it over to the group. Yes?
Mine is a question. How does the Martin Luther King website, how does that get into the top 3 that people would receive if they were to Google his name?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it probably has everything to do with algorithms, and just that, just the name of it itself, martinlutherking.org, is probably something to do with it. Google doesn't really share the algorithms. I wish they did because it would help our library databases a lot. But I'm assuming that it's because of the name and then because of the content on there. And there are people, professionals, who do that, who actually, what do they call that? Something optimizing, where they tried it so that you get higher and higher in the Google results. So there's a method to that madness. My personal reason, and I'm just guessing here, that it's just because a lot of clicks. People are just Google Martin Luther King, that one comes up, they click it. So if you got thousands, hundreds of thousands of people doing that, it's just going to naturally rise up in the results. I don't know, Dave, or you guys have any?
I will add to that there are various times there are scripts that are written. The hackers always seem to be one step ahead of the programmers. And it's something called Google bombing, which will simulate hits that aren't actually happening, but they're registering as hits and they're moving the site up. One example of this, which is kind of off topic, but when George W. Bush was president, somebody wrote a Google bombing script. So anytime somebody looked for the definition of dumb, it went right to the White House for George W. Bush. Now, I don't mean anything political either way there, but that's just an example of where somebody can take a random piece of information and attach it to something else through writing scripts. Thank you. Anybody else have any reactions or? Shani, Donna?
I was just thinking recently, and I know about this ironically through social media, so make this what you will. But hasn't YouTube very recently cracked down on videos that were spreading misinformation about the vaccine? Is that correct?
Yeah, it was yesterday. They announced that.
Yesterday?
Yeah. Yes.
It's just, I thought it was just very topical.
Absolutely, and there are initiatives with the major social media platforms to do just that. And obviously the quagmire that you get into pretty quickly is the you know, well, how does this affect freedom of speech and somebody's ability to express themselves, even if maybe what they're saying isn't true, if it's not hurting somebody, but and what is information that hurts somebody? I guess it's a complicated issue, but I applaud efforts like that. Even if they end up stepping on somebody's toes, you can always step off and try again, start another way.
Yeah, it's so weird, you know, you hear the term alternative facts, and you think, well, what's an alternative fact? But in some ways, I think we are living in that era of alternative facts now. And I'll give you an example. So probably one of the most famous facts in America is that Columbus discovered America in 1492, right? Everybody knows that. No one's going to question that, right? But wait a minute, there are already people living here. There were millions of people living here already. So then you would have to kind of go back and say, well, he was the first European to discover America. And then I can probably buy, although people would come and say, no, the Vikings were way before he was, blah, 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 blah. And then you say, well, he's the first documented European who discovered, you know, so just, again, we're just living in this crazy time. What is even a fact? What is a fact anymore?
I have struggled with a group that, and I try not to get into the kind of dialogues that this kinds of things create, but when you say we should go down and document and find other sources and whatever, they're saying, national news, CNN, ABC, all of them are blocking the news that's coming through all these other suspects. My bias.
No, right, so like it's one big conspiracy,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
mainstream, and I find that funny because I actually worked in the mainstream media for 17 years, and trust me, we were not organized enough to be able to pull off a conspiracy of that nature. I was not waiting at my desk for Rachel Maddow to call me every night and say, okay, go ahead, print that story, no, kill that story, print that story. It's kind of facetious, but there have been documented times when the mainstream media has sat on stories, when multiple media knew about a story but chose not to report it. I don't think it would be a conspiracy, but the Harvey Weinstein, the sexual abuse to young actresses, that was well known among the media for years. In fact, there's a book about it right now called To Catch and to Kill. It's a great book. But the whole thing was it was Mia Farrow's son, his last name's Farrow, I can't remember his first name, he wrote it, and he had the story, and he worked for the Today Show and NBC, and then he found out that other media, big media, Wall Street, I can't remember exactly, Wall Street Journal, whatever, also knew about these allegations. And so finally, he had to kind of keep shopping around the story until finally the New Yorker did publish it, and then it became the huge story that we all know about today. I really think that's the exception, and maybe I'm blind, maybe I'm just brainwashed too by the mainstream media. But I totally get it. I mean, if you could just say, well, anything that comes from a news source is, if it's a mainstream news source, then it's automatically false. Again, how do you even argue? How do you even argue with that?
Right. Mm-hmm. But that's a really big group of people that are saying that.
No, yeah.
And that's what is so frightening about, no matter how much we learn about how to discern what's true, if there's a whole other group that just believes totally that this, it's really, I don't mean to take all the time here, but I remember going to Abraham Lincoln's Museum in Springfield, Illinois. And I think that's a time, I mean, the press, the articles, they have this wonderful tunnel of all the terrible things that were being said and the lies that were being said about them and about Mary Lincoln. And to me, it sort of is what is happening today. But on that smaller scale, that if you didn't buy the paper, you weren't going to see that, where this is hitting us in our faces every single moment, and it's just so much exponentially bigger and damaging. Yeah.
Yeah, I really, if I could just interject, I really like your point about how can we communicate when we inhabit really sort of disconnected epistemic universes, you know, when the set of things that you trust are just not the set of things that the other people trust. And that is a genuine puzzle. And that is one of the things that, shameless plug here, the Beyond Your Bubble discussion group is going to talk about. Because Beyond Your Bubble, the full title is something like Beyond Your Bubble, How to Converse Across Political Divide. And it's a good book, it's a short book. It leaves some issues kind of unresolved, like it leaves unresolved the question of how to resolve disputes. But it does an excellent job at talking about how one can facilitate productive conversations, you know, and not allow those sorts of differences to so contaminate the conversation that there can't be any mutual understanding.
Yeah, that's a great point. And one thing that I know that the Center for Civic Engagement up in Wausau is kind of devoted to that and has a lot of programming. I use a technique with my students that gets a little uncomfortable sometimes depending on confirmation bias, where they work in groups of 6 and they work with a controversial topic, and they're responsible for finding sources and defending both sides. Now, I know that's reductivism in the sense that there's usually more than 2 sides to a topic, but if I can get them to at least appreciate why somebody might feel the other way by virtue of having to defend something that they don't believe in, I think it's worth it. But it's controversy in the classroom, and I think a lot of faculty would rather steer clear of that. I had 2 guys go at it with fists over gun control. Because it's hot button stuff. But in the end, they gave each other a hug, and we went on with our day. But I think sometimes when we have an opportunity to force, I don't want to say that, don't say I said force, but to set up experiences where students have to confront their confirmation bias, I think that's at least a start in the direction of addressing the problem that you're speaking of. And also Dona's the book clubs, the talking about, you said it's unresolved in the end, but there's a lot of good food for thought about how to have those conversations. With your uncle at Christmas, I had it with my family. It's what so we didn't put somebody on the moon, it was all a Hollywood basement, really?
And again, I'm just thinking about why the work that you are doing is so important. Are you familiar with belief perseverance? I wrote about this. It was something that I read about for my dissertation, and I'm not a psychologist. I'm a philosopher, so I might be misremembering the specifics of the empirical study, and maybe I don't know what the replication standards are here. But I think this information is current. I don't think this is fake news. The short version is, once someone has a belief, even if the evidence in favor of that belief is undercut, the belief perseveres. It's belief perseverance. And the study was fascinating. As I recall, they got some college students and they brought them in and they said, we just want to see how what your aptitude is for detecting fake suicide notes from real suicide notes. Now, in fact, all the suicide notes were fake, but they gave them these notes, and then they got them back, and they told the students, "My gosh, you are." Oh, I'm sorry. Before that, they asked, "How good do you think you are? Do you think you're any good at this?" They would say, "No, I don't think I'm any good at this. No better than average." So then they went through this fake experiment. They were told fake results that, guess what? You are actually very good at detecting fake suicide notes from real suicide notes. And let them go off for like a week or so. Then they brought them back and said, "Oh, by the way, remember that study you did? Turns out that they were all fake. You have no reason to think that you are better than average at detecting fake suicide notes." Okay. then queried them sometime later, do you think you're better than average? And they said, yes, I think I'm better than average. Even though they knew that the only evidence, the only reason they had to believe that was fraudulent. So I think, you know, the moral of that story for me is like, be careful what you allow yourself to believe, because once it's in there, it's hard to get out. So yeah, be careful what you share, because even if you then later on say, by the way, turns out that's not true, and even if people believe you, even if they believe you, it can persist. So very important work.